Russian President Vladimir Putin is currently visiting Iran while the last bastions of ISIL in Iraq and Syria are under siege. How will Russia and its allies engage with America's Middle Eastern partners once their common enemy in ISIL is defeated? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing Monday to Friday on CGTN. Russian President Vladimir Putin is visiting Iran to attend the tripartite summit of Iran, Russia, and Azerbaijan. The three countries said in a joint statement that all parties to the Iran nuclear deal should adhere to their commitments. Putin also pointed out that the nuclear agreement between Iran and the world powers in 2015 is a good pact in line with the expansion of peace and stability in the region, end of quote. Putin added that peace talks to resolve the Syrian crisis were developing positively and that no country could resolve this crisis on its own. For more on Putin's visit to Iran and the role of Iran in the region, we are joined in our Beijing studio. Da-da! Finally, we have you in our Beijing studio. Professor Mohammed Marandi from the University of Tehran. He is the professor and also dean of the World Faculty Studies over there. Welcome, sir, to Beijing.
Thank you.
And also in Moscow, we have Mr. Yury Tavrovsky, professor at Russian People's Friendship University. Professor, hello to you as well. In Boston, longtime friend too, Jim Walsh, Security Studies Program from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Welcome. I want to start with Professor Marandi here in Beijing, not like other times joining us from Iran. What about that? This trilateral development, how much of it is about Russia's confidence in the nuclear deal involving Iran?
Well, I think during the nuclear negotiations, Iran and Russia moved closer to each other, and that had an impact. But I also think that the issue of Syria, the fact that the two countries cooperated extensively in Syria against ISIS and the Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda and their affiliates, that also brought them closer. But also I think just as important is the fact that Russia more recently has been increasingly been sanctioned by the United States alongside Iran, of course. And this has created an incentive, a further incentive for the two countries to grow closer to each other. And part of this meeting is linked to economics and the fact that Azerbaijan is going to be one of the bridges between Iran and Russia. So trade between the two countries, though still not very extensive, but it is growing at a very rapid pace.
Right. Let me go to Professor Tavrovsky as well. What about your assessment? When Washington withdrew already from their earlier commitment about the Iran deal, at least to a certain extent, how much can Russia hold on to it? And will that deal still be relevant at all?
Well, I think we Russians are deeply interested in keeping this nuclear deal because it is one of the mainstays of the global security infrastructure. And we see that America now, under President Trump, is busily destroying this infrastructure, trying to stop international treaties, international organizations. And so if this very important mainstay will be destroyed, then the global situation will suffer. And also the regional security situation will suffer. And let's remember that Iran is our neighbor because we are bordering on each other in Caspian Sea. So we are deeply interested in this nuclear deal.
Mr. Walsh, okay, do you think Russia has any power of persuasion toward the Trump administration about that deal? given the fact that earlier there were some kinds of close interactions between Russia and the Trump administration before the election, as some say?
Well, maybe Russia would have some influence with President Trump. I'm sort of skeptical because Mr. Trump refused to certify the deal most recently, that U.S. law, despite the advice of his own Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and the European allies. So if you're not going to listen to your own cabinet and you're not going to listen to your own European allies, I don't know how much influence Putin might have. Let me quickly add that I don't think that, as you well know, Tian, I'm a big proponent of the Iran deal. But I don't think that's what's driving this Iran-Russia relationship, which really, in some ways, predates the Iran deal. I think this is about national strategic interests.
Right.
It's an opportunity for Russia to have a bigger face in the region and to carry more prestige, to regain some influence it lost after the Cold War. And Iran has its own reasons for wanting to link arms with Russia, which is a neighbor that twice invaded Iran, I might add. But they both have strategic reasons for this dialogue that I think extend beyond the nuclear agreement.
Well, what about that, Professor Marandi? I saw a little bit smile on the side of your mouth. What does that mean?
Well, I think that obviously Iran and Russia do have a history, but things have changed a great deal, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia's foreign policy has changed dramatically. And in recent years, I think there has been a great convergence, a great amount of convergence between Iran and Russia. Both countries are very concerned about extremism, about the Wahhabism that's being exported from some countries in this region. Central Asia is of great concern to the Russians, some of their own territories in southern Russia. And even in Moscow itself, we've seen major terrorist attacks in the past take place in the city. So this is a key issue. And as your guest in Moscow rightly pointed out, not only is Azerbaijan or Armenia and Georgia not only are they bridges, and also Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, but also the Caspian Sea itself makes Iran and Russia countries that share borders. So the relationship between the two countries is natural, and as I said earlier, the more the United States pushes Russia away from itself and Iran, it creates a greater incentive for these two countries to look to each other.
We certainly see that trend. That's why I want to go to you, Professor Tavrovsky. What kind of trend are we seeing now? What kind of map do you see in front of you with the latest changes, whether it's about the Iran nuclear deal, whether it is about Iran's more proactive role in the region and Russia's role in the region vis-a-vis what is going on with the U.S. foreign policy toward the region? What kind of map are you seeing right now?
I think that Russia and other great nations like China, like Iran, are doing what they can under the circumstances. We cannot make President Trump to be more predictable or more peace-loving. So we do what we can. We coordinate our policies. We are working on security arrangements in the micro-regions like Caspian Sea or macro-regions like the Middle East. And I think that Russia is now playing a very important, I'd say, major role in these regions because Russia is predictable. Russia is reliable. And, you know, if you have a friend like Russia, it's very important because you can save your life. Like Syria, yeah? Syria could be annihilated from the world map by now, if not for Putin. And there are many nations like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey, like Iran, like Pakistan. They are trying to make friends with Russia. So I think that we're playing very positive role now in the region.
I see. Professor Marandi, how about that fact that Russia seems to also approaching Saudi Arabia, which of course Iran does not seem to have a very friendly relationship with, and some of the other countries too. Professor Marandi, do you think Tehran will be okay with that? Will be very smooth in its acceptance of whatever Russia's friend could be?
I don't think that's a problem at all for Iran. In Tehran, the view towards Saudi Arabia is that the Saudis are themselves causing problems for their own interests. They invaded Yemen, they supported extremist groups in Syria and Iraq, thus destroying much of both of these countries as a result and antagonizing the populations there. They occupied Bahrain, and then more recently their antagonism and their siege on Qatar is even more extraordinary because they share the same ideology and they shared common policies in the past. So the Saudis are hurting themselves, and if the Russians could help the Saudis move towards a more mainstream approach, a more moderate approach, I think that would be very much welcome. The problem is that the United States is actually, not only under Trump but also under Obama, they did not really push the Saudis in the right direction. They pushed them actually in the opposite direction.
I wish we could have some Saudi Arabia guests to debate with you, Professor Marandi. I'm sure they have different views, but let me just say that this is not a debate about Saudi Arabia, but rather about Iran and Russia. So I want to bring in Mr. Walsh from the U.S. once again. What about that? I mean, when you see things are changing so fast, and when you see from the U.S. perspective that Russia and Iran are really firming up their relationship, there is the arms sales, there is the oil deal, there is the Eurasian corridor and the railway and the linkage, the connectivity, and certainly there is the strategic approaches, as Professor Marandi and Professor Tavrovsky beautifully illustrated. So the U.S. is certainly being left behind, it seems. What exactly is your national interest, Mr. Walsh?
Well, a couple of things. I don't know if we're being left behind. It's certainly the case that President Trump, if he makes mistakes in the region, and he could make mistakes in the region, it will open up opportunities for Russia to take a greater role. I think that's absolutely the case. But unfortunately, I would report or remind you that the U.S. is actually increasing its troop presence in the Middle East. Lots of troops were undeclared. We have some more recent announcements that suggest those numbers are increasing. So I actually think that's a worry. Let me say that if Russia can act in any way that moderates the Saudi-Iranian rivalry, I think that would be a good thing. I would welcome that. The other possibility here, by the way, is something much uglier, which is that we get a replication of the Cold War in the Middle East, where you have the U.S. on the Saudi side, you have Russia on the Iranian side, and then everyone just battles each other to the last person standing. That would be very unfortunate, and I hope that doesn't happen.
Well,
and as far as my Russian colleague talking about the reliability and friendship of the Russians, I would only say that I think Crimea, Ukraine, and Georgia might have a different point of view.
Well, Professor Tavrovsky, of course it is time for you to speak up.
Well, yes. I don't like the Cold War. You know, I lived through the Cold War for many, many years. And I'm afraid the Cold War continues. But on the other hand, we could have some sort of cooperation with the United States and Syria. And this cooperation continues to this day. So maybe Russo-Chinese, Russo-Persian strategic partnerships will make Americans to behave and to admit that other nations have their national interests. And then the Cold War will end. So I think this is our contribution to the ending of the Cold War.
All right. Different views. But Professor Marandi, fundamental question. That Iran nuclear deal has to be there because the international community has been working so hard for it. And it's setting a precedent for the other nuclear crisis that we are likely to see in the other parts of the world. But Professor Marandi, once the U.S. withdraws from it, What can Iran do? Are we going to see a domino effect from Iran's perspective? The Western countries keep on withdrawing from that because they are afraid of being so-called punished by the United States. Professor Marandi, what would that leave to Iran?
That's a very good question. We don't know. So far, the Europeans have been very robust in their opposition to the United States. But this is just verbal, and it's moving beyond statements and declarations is what's important. If the Europeans defend their businesses and their businessmen and women against the United States and prevent the Americans from intimidating them, then yes, I think there's a greater chance of the agreement remaining intact despite Trump. But if the Europeans at the end of the day submit to the will of the U.S. administration, then I think it's going to be a very different situation. Iran will simply not stay in an agreement where it abides by its commitments and it gets nothing in return. And the interesting thing is that the Iranian leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, after the nuclear deal was signed, said that if the United States behaves correctly and abides by its commitments, maybe in future the Iranians and the Americans can talk about other issues. But the Americans, both under Obama and especially under Trump, they've chosen to violate the agreement time after time after time.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time for this round of discussion when we're talking about buying the time. We hope all parties would buy the time for the peace of the region. We really hope that would be the case, but I guess it takes a lot of efforts and a lot of watching from different perspectives. Thank you so much, Mohammed Marandi, Yury Tavrovsky, Jim Walsh, coming from Iran, Russia, and the United States. Really appreciate it. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN in your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.